Somewhere off the southern coast of England, on a moonless night in the autumn of 1748, a cutter called the Speedwell slipped through water as dark and quiet as ink. She carried no lantern. Her crew spoke in whispers if they spoke at all, and the only sound was the low creak of rigging and the soft rhythmic pull of oars when the wind dropped. She was loaded so heavily with brandy casks, bolts of French lace, and tea chests stitched into wool bales that her deck sat only a few inches above the waterline. One large wave and she would have gone under without ceremony. The captain, a man named Thomas Kingsmill, stood at the stern and watched the black outline of the Sussex coast materialise slowly from the darkness, the way a thought forms before you have words for it. He had made this crossing dozens of times. He knew every current and every shoal, every cove where a boat could be pulled up without leaving marks in the mud, and every customs officer in 3 counties, most of them by their first names, several by the names of their wives, and a few by debts they owed to men connected to Kingsmill himself. On the beach below the chalk cliffs, a line of men waited with ponies and muffled lanterns. They were farm labourers, most of them, and cobblers and carpenters who spent their days in ordinary trades. But on nights like this they became part of the most sophisticated, best organised, and most stubbornly persistent criminal enterprise that England had ever seen. They moved goods through a landscape they had known since childhood, through forests and cart tracks and cellars under tavern floors, and they did it with such efficiency that historians would later estimate roughly half of all the tea consumed in 18th century England had never passed through a customs house. Half of all the tea in England. This is a story about that kind of audacity. It is a story that starts not with Thomas Kingsmill or with England, but in a time so ancient that the nations enforcing the taxes had not yet been invented. It is a story about the eternal human conviction that a rule created by people far away, applied to goods that flow naturally between willing buyers and willing sellers, is a rule that deserves to be broken. It is at its heart a story about ingenuity, about the lengths to which ordinary people will go when the difference between what something costs legally and what it costs through a more creative arrangement is large enough to make the risk feel almost reasonable. Smuggling is as old as trade. Wherever one group of people decided that goods crossing an invisible line should be taxed or restricted, other people immediately began imagining ways to move those goods across that line without paying the tax or acknowledging the restriction. The smuggler and the customs officer were born at the same moment, 2 sides of the same coin, locked in an improvised dance that would carry on for millennia with neither side ever fully winning. What makes the history of smuggling so endlessly compelling is not the crime itself. Contraband tea is not, in the abstract, a morally electrifying topic, but the human texture that surrounds it. The villages that conspired together to hide goods under church floors. The magistrates who looked the other way because their own cellars were stocked with French wine that had arrived without paperwork. The captains who knew the stars and the tides better than any naval officer, who had grown up on these waters and could navigate by the smell of the air. The women who sewed brandy flasks into the linings of their skirts and walked past soldiers without blinking. The codes and signals and decoys and false trails, and underneath all of it the enduring question, how did they keep getting away with it? How did a network of fishermen, farmers and tavern keepers consistently outmaneuver the most powerful naval force in the world? The answer, as with most things in history, is complicated, layered, and more interesting than you might expect. It begins not in England, and not in the 18th century, but in a world that was already ancient when Rome was young, a world of Phoenician traders and Bronze Age merchants, of ships carrying goods that rulers in distant palaces had decided should not move freely through the world. Long before there were customs houses, there were customs. Long before there were import duties in the modern sense, there were temple taxes, harbour fees, river tolls, and royal monopolies. And wherever those restrictions existed, so did the human determination to circumvent them. The earliest records of anything resembling smuggling come from ancient Mesopotamia, where clay tablets dating back more than 4,000 years document merchants falsifying inventories and misrepresenting the contents of shipments to reduce the tribute owed to temple administrators. The goods being hidden were typically textiles, metals, and grain, the same basic commodities that would be smuggled through the ancient Mediterranean, across medieval Europe, and through the colonial Atlantic. The specific goods change with the centuries, but the logic is always the same. Someone has produced something valuable, someone else wants to buy it, and a third party, usually armed and backed by institutional authority, is demanding a portion of the transaction for reasons that feel, to the buyer and seller, more or less arbitrary. The Phoenicians, who were probably the most accomplished traders of the ancient world, operated across the Mediterranean with a pragmatism about rules that their contemporaries found simultaneously useful and infuriating. Carthage, the great Phoenician colony in North Africa, grew fabulously wealthy partly by controlling trade routes, and partly by being reliably creative about which portions of the tribute system they considered binding. Phoenician traders moved tin from Britain to the Levant, purple dye from Tyre to markets across the known world, and silver from Iberia to anyone who would pay for it. Along the way, they developed what historians politely call informal trading practices, which is to say they had a working system for moving goods past official inspectors at the ports of foreign kingdoms without declaring everything of value. The Greeks were similarly practical about these matters. The city-states of ancient Greece relied heavily on port taxes for their revenues, and the men who worked the harbours at Athens and Corinth were well acquainted with the art of the concealed shipment. Wine amphorae with false bottoms, grain sacks with valuables buried at their centres, the use of trusted intermediaries in foreign ports who knew the local inspectors personally, and could arrange for a conveniently thorough inspection of a decoy shipment while the real cargo was unloaded elsewhere. Rome took all of this to new heights, as Rome tended to do with everything it inherited from the Greeks. The Roman Empire was, among many other things, a vast taxation machine, and the taxation of trade was one of its primary revenue sources. The porteria, the Roman system of customs duties levied at key points throughout the empire, was administered by tax farmers, private contractors who paid the government for the right to collect duties and then collected as much as they could over and above that sum. This arrangement was legendarily corrupt, and the merchants who moved goods through the Roman world became expert at working the system in both directions, bribing the tax farmers when possible, deceiving them when not. One area where Roman smuggling reached something like industrial scale was in the grain trade. Egypt was the breadbasket of the empire, and the movement of grain from Alexandria to Rome was both massively important and heavily regulated. The records from Egyptian ports reveal repeated cases of ships carrying more grain than their manifests declared, or declaring low-grade grain while carrying the more valuable varieties, or simply redirecting portions of official shipments to private buyers before the official distribution reached Rome. The men involved in these schemes were not shadowy criminals. They were established merchants, port administrators, and ship captains operating within the normal commercial world of the empire, simply applying the universal human instinct to maximize the return on their work by any available means. The Silk Road, which stretched from China through Central Asia to the Mediterranean world, was the greatest trading corridor in the ancient world and also one of the longest-running smuggling operations in human history. The Han Dynasty emperors understood early that silk was not merely a luxury fabric, but a form of economic and diplomatic power, and they attempted, sometimes through laws punishable by death, to keep the techniques of silk production secret and to control the flow of raw silk westward. The prohibition on exporting silkworms or their eggs was absolute, and enforced with the kind of official seriousness that tends to inspire creative countermeasures. The silk trade continued through every prohibition. Merchants smuggled silkworm eggs in hollow walking staves, in the stuffing of saddle blankets, buried in containers of dried food. Byzantine monks, so the famous story goes, carried silkworm eggs from China to Constantinople in hollow canes sometime around 550 CE, effectively breaking China's monopoly on silk production and shifting the economic balance of the ancient world in ways that would echo for centuries. Whether the monk's story is precisely true in its details, the broader truth it represents is accurate. The flow of goods and knowledge across the ancient world was never successfully stopped by imperial decree. The smuggler always found a way. The Silk Road, which stretched from China through Central Asia to the Mediterranean world, was the greatest trading corridor in the ancient world, and also one of the longest-running smuggling operations in human history. The Han Dynasty emperors understood early that silk was not merely a luxury fabric, but a form of economic and diplomatic power, and they attempted, sometimes through laws punishable by death, to keep the techniques of silk production secret and to control the flow of raw silk westward. The prohibition on exporting silkworms or their eggs was absolute and enforced with the kind of official seriousness that tends to inspire creative countermeasures. The silk trade continued through every prohibition. Merchants smuggled silkworm eggs in hollow walking staves, in the stuffing of saddle blankets buried in containers of dried food. Byzantine monks, so the famous story goes, carried silkworm eggs from China to Constantinople in hollow canes sometime around 550 CE, effectively breaking China's monopoly on silk production and shifting the economic balance of the ancient world in ways that would echo for centuries. Whether the monk's story is precisely true in its details, the broader truth it represents is accurate. The flow of goods and knowledge across the ancient world was never successfully stopped by imperial decree. The smuggler always found a way. The ancient port of Alexandria, which served as the Mediterranean world's greatest commercial hub for centuries under both Ptolemaic and Roman rule, developed a particularly elaborate informal trade that operated in the shadows of the official commercial system. The city's position at the junction of the Nile Valley and the Mediterranean made it the natural distribution point for the goods of the East: spices, incense, precious stones, and the fine linens of Egypt itself, and the customs revenues collected at Alexandria were among the most significant in the ancient world. The administration that collected those revenues was also, not coincidentally, among the most thoroughly infiltrated by corruption that the ancient world produced. The papyrus records that survive from Roman Alexandria document a customs service that was simultaneously extractive toward legitimate merchants and remarkably permeable for those with appropriate connections to the men managing the paperwork. The spice trade, which connected the ports of southwestern India and the islands of Southeast Asia to the Mediterranean world through a chain of intermediaries, was built from its earliest days on a foundation of commercial secrecy that was, functionally, a form of systematic deception. The Arab merchants who controlled the sea routes between India and the Red Sea ports guarded the sources of their goods with extraordinary care, spreading deliberate misinformation about where cinnamon and pepper and cloves actually grew in order to prevent their customers and competitors from cutting them out of the supply chain. The stories that Greek and Roman merchants heard about cinnamon being gathered by birds from nests on impossibly high cliffs, or about cassia growing in shallow lakes guarded by monstrous winged creatures, were commercial disinformation of a sophisticated kind, an ancient form of the route-obscuring techniques that smugglers of every era used to protect their supply chains. When the Portuguese rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the end of the 15th century and established a direct sea route to the spice sources of India and Southeast Asia, they were not merely making a geographic discovery. They were attempting to disintermediate one of the world's longest-running informal commercial arrangements. The Arab, Indian, and East African merchants who had managed the spice trade for generations had done so through a combination of geographic knowledge, community relationships, and the systematic withholding of information that had made their position nearly impregnable for centuries. The Portuguese, with their armed caravels and their official monopoly claims, were attempting what every government that has ever tried to suppress a successful informal trade has attempted: to insert official control into a commercial system that had evolved specifically to function without it. The smuggler is rarely, in the popular imagination or in historical reality, a purely villainous figure. He occupies a morally complicated space, outside the law, but operating within a set of personal codes and community loyalties that often feel more immediate and more binding than the abstract rules imposed by distant authorities. The Phoenician trader who misrepresented his cargo to avoid Carthaginian port taxes probably felt entirely justified. The tax was arbitrary. His judgment of a fair price for his own goods was more reliable than any official schedule, and the alternative was to hand over a portion of his livelihood to an administrator he had never met. The Roman grain merchant who skimmed a portion of the official shipment for private sale was feeding a family, maintaining a crew, and operating in a commercial world where everyone around him did the same. These are rationalizations, of course, but they are also recognizable human rationalizations, the kind that continue to make the history of smuggling feel surprisingly contemporary. What the ancient world's traders all understood instinctively is something that modern economists have since formalized, but that has always been functionally obvious to anyone with goods to sell. A tax or restriction that cannot be enforced is not, in commercial terms, a tax or restriction at all. It is an invitation. It is an official declaration that there is a gap between the regulated price and the real price, and that gap will be filled by whoever has the knowledge, the organisation, and the appetite for risk required to fill it. The customs house announces the opportunity. The smuggler accepts it. This has been true for 4,000 years, and the evidence of history suggests it will remain true for whatever comes next. Every empire that has tried to close that gap through force alone has eventually discovered that force is expensive, that enforcement requires more intelligence than any government reliably possesses about its own commercial margins, and that the human instinct to trade freely across political boundaries is at least as persistent as the human instinct to impose them. The medieval wool smugglers of England, the Alexandrian grain merchants who misrepresented their shipments to Roman tax farmers, the Arab spice traders who fed false geographical information to their customers, all of them were, in their different ways, participants in the same ancient argument. They were asserting, through action rather than argument, that the commercial value of goods was determined by the market between willing buyers and willing sellers, not by the official schedule of a customs administration. History has generally, though not always, vindicated them. The market tends to win in the end. It wins not because it is morally superior, but because it is more persistent, more creative, and more distributed than any enforcement apparatus that has ever been brought against it. The Middle Ages added new dimensions to this ancient practice. As European kingdoms consolidated and began building more formal systems of taxation and trade regulation, the incentives for smuggling grew more structured and the operations more organised. Wool, the primary export of medieval England, was taxed heavily on its way out of the country, and English wool merchants became adept at moving fleeces past the designated staple ports, the official export points, by a variety of creative routes. The Channel coast was dotted with small beaches and inlets that had no official inspector and that had been used for informal trade since the Romans left. The men who worked these beaches in the 14th century were the direct predecessors of the Hawkhurst Gang and the Sussex Free, traders of the 18th century. The landscape, the methods, and even some of the family names would remain consistent across 400 years. By the time the age of exploration opened up the world to European trade in the late 15th century, smuggling was a fully established, globally distributed profession, with specialised skills, dedicated infrastructure, and deep roots in the communities that practiced it. The new world of Atlantic commerce would take everything that the ancient and medieval worlds had developed and amplify it enormously, adding new goods, new routes, and new levels of official outrage, and new levels of creative evasion in response. There is a stretch of the English coast between the white cliffs of Dover and the flat marshlands of Romney that, for roughly 100 years beginning in the 1680s, functioned as the beating commercial heart of one of the most organised criminal enterprises in European history. It did not look like that. It looked like small fishing villages and modest farmsteads and quiet market towns where nothing much seemed to happen. But beneath that surface, sometimes quite literally beneath it, in the cellars and tunnels that honeycomb the chalk and clay of this part of England, flowed a river of contraband that by some estimates represented more than half the total value of the official import trade through nearby ports. The goods being smuggled were not by modern standards exotic or alarming. Tea was the most important single commodity. In the early 18th century, the duty on tea imported through official channels was so enormous, at various points in the century it amounted to more than 100% of the wholesale price, that legally sold tea was simply unaffordable for most of the English population. The arithmetic was not complicated. Tea that could be purchased in France or Holland for a few shillings a pound could be sold in England after the official duties for many times that amount. The same tea, moved across the Channel without customs inspection, could be sold at prices that undercut the legitimate trade while still generating substantial profits for everyone involved in the operation. The incentive to smuggle was not merely greed. It was a rational economic response to a taxation policy that had made the legal market functionally impossible for ordinary people. The same logic applied to brandy, to gin, to lace, to tobacco, to silk. All of these goods faced prohibitive duties, and all of them were available in Europe at prices that made the Channel crossing a very attractive commercial proposition for anyone willing to take on the risk. The risk, in the early part of the century, was not insignificant. Death by hanging was the prescribed punishment for a variety of smuggling offences, but the profits were large enough, the local community solidarity was strong enough, and the practical likelihood of conviction was low enough that the trade flourished beyond any serious official ability to suppress it. What made the English smuggling trade of the 18th century genuinely remarkable was its organisation. This was not a matter of individual entrepreneurs making individual crossings. The operations that dominated the Sussex and Kent trade were coordinated enterprises involving hundreds of participants, significant capital investment, sophisticated logistics, and the kind of institutional knowledge that took generations to accumulate. The men who organised the runs, the financiers, effectively, were often prosperous local businessmen who invested in the purchase of goods in France, and the fitting out of fast cutters took their profits at the far end and maintained enough social respectability to conduct simultaneous legitimate businesses. Below them were the captains and crews of the running boats, men whose seamanship was superb and whose knowledge of the local waters was encyclopedic. Below them were the landing parties, the batmen and tubmen who carried the goods up the beach and loaded them onto the ponies, and the spotters who watched for revenue cutters and riding officers, and the stablemen who provided the strings of horses that moved the goods inland through the night. The Hawkhurst Gang represents the most infamous expression of this organisational sophistication, and also its darkest extreme. Operating primarily through the 1730s and 1740s from their headquarters in the village of Hawkhurst in Kent, the gang at its peak controlled a network that stretched from the beaches of East Sussex to the markets of London, with reliable contacts in France, connections to distributors across the southeast of England, and a reputation for violent enforcement that kept both competitors and official informers at bay. At their peak, they were moving hundreds of tons of goods per year, an almost industrial scale of operation. The gang was led, in its most active period, by figures like Thomas Kingsmill and Arthur Gray, men who combined genuine organisational talent with a ruthlessness that eventually brought them down. The story that most vividly captures the Hawkhurst Gang's character, and that shocked even their contemporaries, involves an event in 1747 that became known as the Poole Customs House Raid. A legitimate seizure of a tea cargo by customs officers had resulted in several tons of Hawkhurst tea being locked in the Poole Customs House. The gang's response was extraordinary. They assembled a force of somewhere between 30 and 60 armed men, rode through the night across 2 counties, broke into the customs house, and recovered their cargo, 30 hundredweight of tea, loading it onto their horses and riding home through the middle of the day while villagers along the route cheered them on or watched in carefully maintained ignorance. The spectacle of dozens of armed men openly reclaiming seized contraband in broad daylight was a statement about where the real power lay in this part of England. The customs authorities had the law on their side, but the Hawkhurst Gang had the landscape, the community, and the organisational capacity for overwhelming force when necessary. The government's response would take years to fully materialise, and when it came it would be severe. But for most of the century that preceded it, the free trade in southern England operated with a confidence that the law simply could not dislodge. The communities that supported and protected the smuggling trade did so for reasons that went beyond mere profit, though profit was certainly present throughout. In a rural economy where agricultural wages were chronically low, and where the alternatives to farm labour were limited, the extra income available from carrying goods on a night's run was significant. A labourer who spent 12 hours trudging between rows of turnips might earn a few shillings in a day. The same man carrying tubs of brandy from a beach to an inland dropping point in a single night could earn several times that sum. The incentive was powerful enough that recruitment was never a problem for the large gangs. But beyond the economics, there was a cultural dimension to the community's relationship with the free trade that is harder to quantify but equally important. The riding officers and customs men who attempted to enforce the import duties were, from the perspective of the rural communities they moved through, representatives of a distant government whose demands felt both arbitrary and hostile. The taxes on tea and brandy were not funding local roads or local poor relief. They were flowing into a treasury that financed foreign wars and enriched London merchants. The smugglers, by contrast, were local men, often well-liked, who brought cheap goods to local people and spent their profits locally. The moral accounting in the villages of Sussex and Kent was, for most of the century, firmly on the side of the free traders. This community solidarity expressed itself in practical terms as an almost total unwillingness to provide useful information to the authorities. The customs service relied heavily on informers, on paid intelligence about planned runs and storage locations. And in this part of England, informers were extremely difficult to develop and maintain. Anyone known to have provided information to the revenue faced social ostracism at minimum, and, in the era of the most violent gangs, the genuine risk of savage reprisal. There are documented cases of informers being beaten, of their houses being burned, of their families being threatened into silence. The community's protective shield around the free trade was not gentle. The physical infrastructure of the smuggling trade was embedded in the landscape in ways that took generations to create and that are still partly visible today. The Romney Marsh, that strange flat country between the coast and the Kentish hills, was threaded through with tracks and causeways that existed for no ostensible commercial purpose, but that connected beaches to farms to market towns along routes optimized for moving large volumes of goods quickly in darkness. Farmhouses had cellars with false floors and double walls. Churches, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not, had their crypts used as temporary warehouses between landing and dispersal. Specific trees and hedgerows and landscape features functioned as recognized waypoints in a navigation system that existed nowhere in writing but was memorized by everyone who worked in the trade. There were also the tunnels. The south of England is riddled with tunnels, some of them quite ancient, whose original purposes have been long forgotten but which were enthusiastically adapted to smuggling use. In the town of Rye, which is perhaps the most thoroughly documented of the smuggling communities, a network of underground passages connected taverns to warehouses to private houses in a system that allowed goods to be moved through the centre of town without ever appearing on the streets. Similar networks existed in Deal, in Folkestone, in Hawkhurst, and in dozens of smaller places along the coast. Some of these passages survive and have been explored by local archaeologists and historians. Most have probably been bricked up, collapsed, or built over in the 2 centuries since the trade declined. The world of the 18th century Sussex smuggler was not simply a world of nocturnal beach landings and galloping ponies, though it was certainly that. It was also a commercial world of considerable sophistication, involving letters of credit, trusted agents in French ports, relationships with English bankers who were not too particular about the source of the deposits they received, and a pricing and distribution system that linked the beaches of East Sussex to the cup of tea on the breakfast table of a merchant's wife in London. The free trade was, in its mature form, a parallel commercial economy operating alongside the official one, drawing on the same human desires and commercial skills, but organised around the evasion of the state rather than its accommodation. The figure of the riding officer, the customs employee whose job was to patrol the roads and lanes of the smuggling country and intercept goods in transit, has been somewhat caricatured in the popular history of the period as either a bumbling incompetent or a venal criminal, too stupid to catch the smugglers or too corrupt to try. The reality was more complicated and in some ways more tragic. Many riding officers were ordinary men attempting to do a genuinely dangerous job in a social environment that made it nearly impossible. They were systematically outnumbered. They worked alone or in small groups through country that the smugglers knew intimately, and they themselves might be new to. They were poorly paid, which made them vulnerable to the very corruption they were supposed to prevent. And they operated in communities where virtually everyone they encountered had a relationship with the trade, as participant, as customer, or as the relation of someone who depended on it for their livelihood. There are accounts in the customs records of riding officers who were simply unable to do their job because there was no place to stay along their patrol route where the landlord was not connected to the smuggling gangs. No tavern where the conversations around him would not stop when he entered. No village where an anonymous tip about a planned run would not reach the landing party within hours of his receiving it. He moved through a landscape of polite, pervasive, collectively maintained obstruction that was more effective than any physical barrier could have been. The women of the Sussex and Kent communities played roles in this landscape that have been underappreciated in the more swashbuckling histories of the period. They were not merely passive recipients of the wealth the trade generated, though they benefited from it. They were active participants in its operational security, the keepers of the hidden cellars, the managers of the safe houses, the women who carried intelligence about revenue movements wrapped in the ordinary business of going to market, and the women who, when necessary, created diversions or provided false information to the riding officers who came to their doors. There are documented cases of women sewing contraband into the linings of their clothes to move it past searches, of women who ran the distribution networks while the men were at sea, and of women who managed the financial arrangements that kept the trade capitalized between runs. The violence that characterized the most organized gangs was real and sometimes horrifying, and it constitutes a necessary corrective to the romanticism that the smuggling era tends to attract. The Hawkhurst Gang's most notorious act of violence, the torture and murder of an informer named Daniel Chater and a customs officer named William Galley in 1748, shocked contemporaries precisely because it revealed the gang's willingness to go beyond the usual intimidation of witnesses into outright murder of anyone who threatened their operation. Chater had been identified as the man who had given evidence against a gang member. He was seized along with Galley, who was escorting him to give his testimony. What followed was an extended, brutal killing that the subsequent murder trial documented in detail that the newspapers of the time reprinted widely, contributing significantly to the shift in public opinion that made the eventual suppression of the gang possible. This shift matters because it illustrates the limits of the community solidarity that had protected the trade for so long. The Sussex and Kent villages had accommodated, and in many cases celebrated, the smuggling operations as long as they remained within a kind of tacit community charter. The goods being moved were harmless, the violence was directed at the authorities rather than civilians, and the economic benefits flowed broadly through the community. When the gang began killing informers and threatening the safety of anyone who might give evidence, the calculus changed. The community's protection of the trade was always contingent on the trade remaining something the community could justify to itself, something that, however illegal, was not monstrous. When it crossed that line, the community's silence became more difficult to maintain. The decline of the great smuggling era in England came not from any single decisive intervention, but from a gradual accumulation of pressures that, over the second half of the 18th century, slowly made the trade less profitable and more dangerous. The execution of Thomas Kingsmill and several other Hawkhurst gang leaders in the late 1740s and 1750s disrupted the most organised operations. The government's passage of the Indemnity Act of 1736, which briefly offered pardons to smugglers who turned themselves in, produced limited results but signalled a new seriousness of intent. More consequentially, the Commutation Act of 1784, which dramatically reduced the duty on tea from an average of over 100% to approximately 12.5%, essentially destroyed the economic logic of the tea smuggling trade in a single stroke. When the duty came down, the profit margin evaporated. The men who had risked their lives and their freedom for the difference between the French price and the English price found that the difference was now too small to justify the risk. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the English smuggling era, and it is one that would be learned and forgotten and relearned repeatedly in every subsequent era. The most effective weapon against organised smuggling is not enforcement. It is the removal of the incentive. When taxes are set, at levels that reflect genuine policy goals rather than fiscal desperation, when the gap between the official price and the smuggled price is small enough that the risk-reward calculation stops making sense, the smuggling trade withers. The riding officers and revenue cutters and gallows could not suppress the free trade in Sussex and Kent, while the tea duty remained above 100%. A single Act of Parliament, reducing the duty to a sane level, accomplished in months what a century of enforcement had failed to achieve. Cornwall is not Sussex, where the southeastern counties of England face France. Across a channel that is narrow enough on a clear day to see the other side, Cornwall faces west into the open Atlantic, a long jagged peninsula of granite cliffs and hidden coves pointing like a finger toward the Americas. The smuggling culture here was older, darker, and more deeply embedded in the landscape than almost anywhere else in Britain, and it came in a form that is, even now, slightly difficult to discuss without controversy. The legend of the Cornish wreckers, the people who lured ships onto rocks with false lights and then plundered the cargo, is one of those stories that exists simultaneously as historical truth, local mythology, and ongoing scholarly dispute. The broad outlines are well established. Cornwall's coast is genuinely treacherous, with submerged rocks and unpredictable currents that have claimed an enormous number of ships over the centuries. When a ship went down, or even when it ran aground without sinking, the question of who had rights to the cargo was legally complex and practically impossible to enforce. The practice of salvaging goods from wrecked ships, known in law as wrecking when the crew was dead and technically different from legitimate salvage when any crew member survived, was so widespread along the Cornish coast that it became a customary right in the minds of local communities, regardless of what the law said about ownership. The darker accusation that lights were actively used to mislead ships onto rocks, effectively engineering the disaster rather than merely profiting from it, is harder to establish with certainty. There are contemporary accounts, there are folk traditions, and there are the careful words of ministers and customs officials who repeatedly reported the practice as real and ongoing. The Vicar of Morwenstow, the eccentric Reverend Robert Stephen Hawker, wrote in the 19th century about the wrecking practices he believed he had witnessed, and his testimony is often cited as evidence of the tradition's existence. But Hawker was a colourful figure whose relationship to literal truth was sometimes flexible, and historians have debated for decades how much of his account reflects actual practice, and how much is the romantic embellishment that Victorian England loved to apply to Celtic maritime culture. What is not disputed is that Cornish communities had a sophisticated, organised and very effective system for monitoring the coast for wrecks and moving quickly to salvage goods before the official authorities could respond. When a ship went down, word spread through the coastal villages with extraordinary speed, faster than any official communication system could match, and within hours, boats would be putting out, and men with ropes and horses would be assembling on the nearest accessible beach. The goods that came ashore were not simply pocketed by whoever reached them first. They were distributed according to established customary rules that recognised the contributions of different participants, protected the rights of families who had lost members in previous salvage operations, and reserved specific portions for local institutions, including, in some areas, the church. The overlap between wrecking and smuggling in Cornwall was substantial, and not merely because both involved moving goods without official permission. Many of the same families, the same boats, and the same networks of inland distributors were involved in both activities. The coves and pathways used to land French brandy on a Tuesday night might be used to store salvage from a Spanish merchantman the following Saturday morning. The men who knew the currents well enough to navigate safely in darkness were the same men who could be most useful in approaching a wreck. The community's practiced indifference to the revenue service made them equally indifferent to questions about where their cargo had come from. Particular families became legendary in the wrecking tradition, and particular stretches of coast acquired reputations that are still reflected in place names. Prussia Cove, on the south coast of Cornwall between Penzance and Helston, took its name from a smuggler named John Carter, who was known, somewhat improbably, as the King of Prussia, and who operated from this small rocky inlet, an enterprise of considerable sophistication that combined legitimate fishing with highly organised smuggling runs to France. Carter's operation was notable partly for its scale and partly for an ethical code that Carter apparently insisted upon. Goods were not to be taken from vessels still in danger of sinking, crew members were not to be harmed, and the operation was to be run, insofar as possible, like a business rather than a crime. Whether Carter actually maintained these standards in practice is debatable, but the story of the King of Prussia became embedded in Cornish folk memory as a kind of archetype of the acceptable smuggler, the man who defied the government's taxes but played by his own rules in everything else. The relationship between the Cornish churches and the smuggling trade is one of the more genuinely fascinating threads in this story, and one that illuminates the full depth of the trade's community integration. There are documented cases of church crypts being used as storage for contraband, of clergymen who were known to be complicit in the trade, and of congregations who turned up for Sunday services knowing perfectly well that the space beneath their feet contained French brandy awaiting distribution. The moral theology of this arrangement was apparently not a source of significant local controversy. The argument, such as it was, ran that the king's tax collectors were not agents of God, that the goods flowing along the coast were not harming anyone, and that a community's right to earn its living from the sea in whatever way the sea offered was not something a distant parliament could legitimately curtail. One story that circulates persistently in the literature of Cornish smuggling, and whose details are too perfectly illustrative not to include, involves a clergyman who is said to have interrupted his Sunday sermon with the announcement that a wreck had gone aground on the beach below, and then, removing his vestments with practised speed, added that before the entire congregation rushed down to help themselves to the cargo, he intended to say a brief prayer, and also to get a head start. The story is almost certainly apocryphal, or at minimum much embellished in the retelling. but the image it presents of a community so thoroughly organised around the informal economy of the sea that even its religious life accommodated that reality captures something true about the culture of the Cornish coast in the age of smuggling. The physical landscape of Cornwall itself seems designed for the kinds of concealment and evasion that the trade required. The North Cornish coast facing the Atlantic is one of the most dramatic and inhospitable in Europe. Enormous cliffs dropping vertically into pounding surf, with here and there a cove that can be reached by the right boat at the right tide under the right conditions, and which is invisible from above and from the sea except from a very specific angle. The men who knew these coves knew them from childhood, had learned their tides and their particular dangers from fathers and grandfathers, who had fished them and supplemented their fishing incomes with whatever the sea brought in more or less informally. The knowledge was intimate, embodied, and not the kind of thing that could be acquired by a revenue officer assigned from London to inspect the coast. This argument, which is really a version of the argument made by free traders everywhere, in every era, contains within it a truth and a comfortable self-deception, existing in uneasy coexistence. The truth is that taxation is a human institution, that the line between fair contribution to the common good and extortion at the barrel of a revenue officer's pistol is genuinely contested, and that communities who feel their economic survival threatened by rules they had no voice in making have understandable reasons to resist those rules. The self-deception is the elision of what happens to the ship that goes on the rocks, to the sailors who drown in Cornish waters, to the merchants in distant cities who lose their investments when the cargo disappears before any official can inspect it. The wrecking tradition declined significantly through the 19th century as maritime infrastructure improved, better lighthouses, better charts, better communication, and as the laws around salvage were clarified and enforced more consistently. The Cornwall of the 21st century celebrates its smuggling heritage as a tourist attraction, and the old paths and coves and stories have been absorbed into a benign local mythology of independent spirits resisting unjust authority. But for the ships that went down and the men who went with them, there was nothing benign about it. The Caribbean in the late 17th and early 18th centuries was, by any reasonable assessment, a place where the distinction between piracy, smuggling, and legitimate trade had collapsed almost completely. The various European powers, England, France, Spain, the Netherlands, had each established colonies and trading systems in the islands and along the coasts of the Americas, and each had attempted, with wildly varying success, to impose mercantilist trade regimes that restricted colonial commerce to officially sanctioned channels. The theory was that colonies existed to produce raw materials for the mother country and to buy manufactured goods from the mother country, and that all of this commerce should flow through the mother country's merchants and the mother country's ports, generating customs revenue for the mother country's treasury. The practical reality, as anyone who spent time in the Caribbean could observe, was that this system served the interests of a relatively small number of licensed merchants and trading companies, while creating enormous inefficiencies and absurdities for everyone else. A sugar planter in Jamaica, who needed iron tools, timber, and salt fish, could get all of these things perfectly well from New England traders who arrived regularly with exactly the right goods at reasonable prices. But the Navigation Acts, which required all trade with English colonies to be carried in English ships and through English ports, made this direct, sensible commerce illegal. The planter was supposed to ship his sugar to England, wait for it to be processed there, and then buy back his tools and supplies from English merchants who had charged London prices on everything. The New England trader was supposed to sail to England, unload his provisions, reload them as English goods, and then come back to Jamaica. Nobody actually did this, because it was preposterous. Instead, the Caribbean developed an entire commercial culture organised around the creative circumvention of these restrictions. The small islands that the major powers had neglected or disputed, Tortuga, St. Thomas, Providence, and various others at different moments in the century, became hubs for an informal trade that supplied everyone who needed goods without asking too many questions about where they had come from or where they were going. The line between these informal traders and out-and-out pirates was, as the historian Marcus Rediker and others have documented exhaustively, genuinely thin. A man who traded without a license was a smuggler. A man who traded without a license and who occasionally seized a cargo he wanted without paying for it was a pirate. A man who did the same things but had a letter of marque from a colonial governor was a privateer and therefore officially legal. The same man might occupy all three categories in the course of a single year, depending on circumstances, paperwork, and which governor was currently in need of what. Port Royal, Jamaica, before the earthquake that destroyed much of it in 1692, was the best example in the Western Hemisphere of a city that had organised its entire existence around this ambiguity. It was simultaneously a legitimate English colonial port, the base of operations for English privateers who raided Spanish shipping with at least nominal official authorisation, a market for goods of every description and origin, and a place where the revenue officers who might theoretically have been enforcing the Navigation Acts were either too outnumbered, too well bribed, or too sensible to try. Contemporary visitors described a town of extraordinary commerce, remarkable vice, and conspicuous prosperity, a prosperity that flowed directly from the fact that it was the Caribbean's most reliable place to sell anything without explanation and buy anything without receipts. The role of rum in Caribbean smuggling is both economically significant and somewhat symbolically perfect. Rum was a product of the Caribbean, distilled from molasses, a byproduct of sugar production, and it was both cheap to produce in the islands and enormously in demand in the American colonies and in Britain. The Molasses Act of 1733, passed by the British Parliament at the insistence of the sugar-growing interests in the British Caribbean islands, attempted to prevent the American colonists from buying the cheaper molasses available from French and Dutch Caribbean islands by imposing a heavy duty on foreign molasses. The intention was to protect British Caribbean planters by forcing American distillers to use only British Caribbean product. The American response was essentially to keep buying French and Dutch molasses and simply not declare it. The molasses trade continued more or less as before. The customs revenues that the Molasses Act was supposed to generate materialised at a tiny fraction of their projected levels. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 10 and 30% of the molasses traded in colonial American ports was properly declared and dutied, which means somewhere between 70 and 90% was moving through what we might politely call an informal channel. The merchants of Boston and Newport and Providence grew wealthy on this trade, and some of them became prominent civic figures in the process. Their prosperity was built on the same foundation as Thomas Kingsmill's prosperity in Kent. The gap between the official price and the market price was large enough to make the risk worthwhile. The culture of the Caribbean trade shaped attitudes toward commerce, law, and government authority in the American colonies in ways that would eventually have enormous consequences. What the Caribbean taught the men who came of age in it was something that would prove enormously consequential. That official commercial rules were not facts of nature but political choices, that those choices could be resisted with practical success, and that the community which organised around that resistance could be more cohesive and more powerful than the distant government trying to impose its will. A generation of colonial merchants who spent their careers navigating those lessons would carry them northward into the political crisis that was already building along the American seaboard, and what had been a commercial habit would become, in the right circumstances, a revolutionary philosophy. The figure of the colonial governor deserves particular attention in any honest account of Caribbean smuggling, because the colonial governor occupies an extraordinarily ambiguous position in this history. Officially, the governor was the representative of the Crown, charged with enforcing its laws and protecting its revenues. In practice, the governor of any Caribbean colony in the early 18th century was a man stationed far from home, dependent on local cooperation for his security and his quality of life, surrounded by merchants whose prosperity derived from trade that was technically illegal, and acutely aware that the naval force theoretically at his disposal was chronically insufficient to patrol the coastline under his jurisdiction. The temptation to accommodate this reality was nearly universal. Some governors were openly corrupt, accepting direct payments from smuggling merchants in exchange for looking away from obvious violations, or granting privateering commissions to vessels that then operated as effectively as pirates. Others maintained a studied ignorance that allowed the trade to flourish while preserving their official deniability. A very few attempted genuine enforcement, and found themselves opposed not only by the merchants but by their own administrations, which depended on the goodwill of the same commercial class they were supposed to police. The historian Karl Breidenbach documented case after case, in his study of colonial port towns, of governors who served nominal terms of vigorous prosecution followed by quiet accommodation once they understood the practical realities of their position. The pirates themselves, the Blackbeards and Bartholomew Roberts and Calico Jacks, who dominate the romantic mythology of the period, existed in a symbiotic relationship with the smuggling trade that is more intimate than the popular narrative usually acknowledges. The same coves and islands that sheltered smuggling operations sheltered pirate vessels. The same fences who moved smuggled goods without documentation could move pirated goods with equal discretion. The same colonial merchants who purchased French molasses without paying the Molasses Act duties could purchase, through appropriate intermediaries, cargo that had been liberated from its original owners somewhat more directly. The informal economy of the Caribbean did not draw sharp lines between its different varieties of unofficial commerce. What brought the Great Pirate Age to its end in the 1720s was not primarily naval suppression, though the Royal Navy did eventually mount effective patrols. It was a combination of factors that cumulatively made piracy less sustainable as a commercial enterprise. The growth of organised naval presence, the hardening of colonial attitudes as the commercial class that had once been complicit in the trade decided that piracy had become a threat to commerce rather than an accommodation of it, and the execution, dramatic, public, and thoroughly covered in the colonial newspapers, of the most prominent pirate captains. The message that the trials of 1718 and 1719 sent was that the era of the accommodating governor was ending, and that the new regime would enforce the difference between licensed privateer and unlicensed pirate with genuine seriousness. But smuggling continued long after piracy was suppressed, because smuggling had always been the more fundamental and more economically rational enterprise. The pirate required violence to conduct his business. The smuggler required only secrecy. The pirate's career was necessarily short because it generated intense official attention. The smuggler's career could span decades because official attention could be managed, deflected, and in the worst case survive through the simple expedient of cooperation with the authorities in exchange for reduced charges. The pirate had no exit strategy. The smuggler could always become a legitimate merchant, and many of them did. What the Caribbean taught the men who came of age in it was something that would prove enormously consequential. That official commercial rules were not facts of nature but political choices, that those choices could be resisted with practical success, and that the community which organised around that resistance could be more cohesive and more powerful than the distant government trying to impose its will. A generation of colonial merchants who spent their careers navigating those lessons would carry them northward into the political crisis that was already building along the American seaboard, and what had been a commercial habit would become, in the right circumstances, a revolutionary philosophy. John Hancock is remembered in American history primarily as the man whose enormous, defiant signature dominates the Declaration of Independence. His name so associated with bold assertion that John Hancock became a colloquial American term for a signature of any kind. What is somewhat less central to the patriotic narrative is that Hancock was, at the time he signed that document, one of the most accomplished and successful smugglers in the American colonies. This is not a marginal or disputed historical footnote. Hancock's fortune was built substantially on the trade between Massachusetts and the French and Dutch Caribbean islands that the Molasses Act was supposed to prevent. His merchant fleet, operating out of Boston, moved molasses, wine, and other goods with a reliable creativity about customs declarations that the revenue authorities found frustrating in direct proportion to their inability to prove specific violations. His warehouse on Hancock Wharf in Boston was a centre of colonial commerce in all its varieties, official and otherwise, and his relationships with the Boston merchant community, and through them with the political networks that would become the revolutionary movement, were products of a commercial world where everyone understood that the British trade laws were enforced selectively at best. The specific incident that transformed Hancock from a wealthy smuggler into a revolutionary icon occurred in 1768, when customs officers seized his sloop Liberty on suspicion of having landed a cargo of Madeira wine without paying the required duties. The seizure of the Liberty triggered riots in Boston that injured several customs officials and drove others to take refuge on a Royal Navy warship in the harbour. The British government's response, sending troops to Boston to restore order, escalated the confrontation in exactly the way that a thoughtful colonial policy might have sought to avoid. Within 18 months, those troops were involved in the Boston Massacre. Within 5 years, British attempts to tighten control over colonial trade had generated enough organised resistance to light the fuse of revolution. The American response was, essentially, to keep buying French and Dutch molasses and simply not declare it. The molasses trade continued more or less as before, The customs revenues that the Molasses Act was supposed to generate materialized at a tiny fraction of their projected levels. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 10 and 30% of the molasses traded in colonial American ports was properly declared and dutied, which means somewhere between 70 and 90% was moving through what we might politely call an informal channel. The merchants of Boston and Newport and Providence grew wealthy on this trade, and some of them became prominent civic figures in the process. Their prosperity was built on the same foundation as Thomas Kingsmill's prosperity in Kent. The gap between the French price and the English price was large enough to make the risk worthwhile. The customs service in colonial Boston was a branch of the British government that managed the remarkable trick of being simultaneously oppressive and ineffective, not a combination that generates affection or respect. Its officers were appointed from London, often as rewards for political service rather than because of relevant expertise, and they arrived in the colonies knowing very little about the commercial world they were supposed to police and dependent on local knowledge that the local commercial community was extremely reluctant to provide. The result was a customs apparatus that collected a fraction of the duties legally owed, that was openly mocked by the merchant community, and that generated an enormous amount of irritation without generating a corresponding amount of revenue. The specific mechanics of how Boston's merchants avoided the duties are well documented in the customs records and in the correspondence of frustrated officials who tried and largely failed to enforce the trade laws. Ships would arrive at night and unload portions of their cargo before presenting for official inspection in the morning. Manifests were written in ways that described goods vaguely enough to be consistent with whatever declaration the merchant found convenient. The practice of landing before entry, unloading cargo before the official customs inspection that was supposed to precede it, was so common that it was essentially standard practice in the port. The customs officers who attempted to stop it faced social hostility, legal harassment through the colonial courts, and in several cases physical intimidation. The men who organised this commercial resistance, the Hancocks, the Otises, the Adamses, moved with practised ease between the commercial world of the informal trade and the political world of colonial self-government. Their argument that taxation without representation is tyranny was a principled constitutional claim, and the claim was genuine. But it was also an argument that fitted with extraordinary convenience the commercial interests of men whose fortunes rested on a trade that the Parliament they had no voice in had decided to tax. The alignment between principle and interest is not suspicious. It is one of the more reliable motors of historical change. People fight most effectively for principles that also happen to serve their practical interests. It is more structural than that. The British government's decision to get serious about enforcing its colonial trade laws in the 1760s, after decades of salutary neglect, during which the laws had existed on paper while the reality was systematic circumvention, felt to colonial merchants not as the imposition of new regulations but as the betrayal of an existing arrangement. The trade had developed, the fortunes had been made, the commercial and social networks had been built on an implicit understanding that the rules would not actually be enforced. When London suddenly decided to enforce them, by stationing naval vessels in colonial harbours, by empowering customs officials with new tools, by requiring revenue cases to be tried in admiralty courts where juries of sympathetic colonists could not acquit the smugglers, the response was fury. The Stamp Act of 1765 was protested on principle. The Townshend duties were resisted through non-importation agreements. The Tea Act of 1773, which actually lowered the retail price of tea in the colonies while making it impossible for smuggled Dutch tea to compete, was resisted with particular vehemence, and it is worth understanding why. The East India Company, granted a monopoly on the colonial tea trade by the Tea Act, was doing the colonies a financial favour in the narrow sense of reducing the price of tea. But the smugglers who had been supplying the colonial market with Dutch tea at competitive prices saw their business destroyed, and the colonial merchants who had profited from that trade saw their commercial independence threatened by a monopoly system that cut them out of the distribution chain entirely. The Boston Tea Party, 342 chests of East India Company tea deposited at the bottom of Boston Harbour on a December night in 1773, was, among other things, a statement by the colonial smuggling interest about what it thought of government-granted monopolies. The men who climbed aboard those ships wore Mohawk disguises, but their economic interests were perfectly transparent. They were defending a commercial system that had operated outside official channels for decades, and that they were not prepared to have replaced by a system of officially sanctioned monopoly. The broader point is that the American Revolution, whatever else it was in significant part a defense of smuggling rights. The ideological language of natural rights and no taxation without representation was genuine and deeply held by many of the revolution's leaders, but it was also the language best suited to translate the very specific commercial grievances of colonial merchants, men whose fortunes had been built on the informal economy of the Atlantic trade, into a mass political movement that could draw in farmers, artisans, and ordinary working people who had no personal stake in the brandy trade or the Madeira wine business, but who could understand and respond to the language of liberty and resistance to tyranny. The revolutionary committees and Sons of Liberty chapters that organised resistance to British authority were, in many port cities, essentially the social infrastructure of the smuggling trade given a political purpose. The same networks of tavern keepers, ship captains, warehouse operators, and waterfront labourers who had organised the movement of contraband goods, organised the committees of correspondence, the non-importation agreements, and ultimately the militias that fought at Lexington and Concord. The skills were similar: coordination under pressure, the maintenance of secrecy, the management of information in a hostile environment, the ability to move quickly and quietly through familiar terrain. After independence, the American government faced the same challenge that every government faces in relation to its smuggling populations. Having relied on them to fight the revolution, how do you now ask them to pay the customs duties? The Constitution gave the federal government the power to levy import duties, which it did, and the customs enforcement challenges of the early republic were substantial. Alexander Hamilton's Treasury Department spent considerable energy attempting to build a customs service that would actually collect the revenues the new nation needed to function, and the response from the maritime communities of New England and the Middle Atlantic states was a continuation of the same creative approach to compliance that had characterized the colonial period. The revolution had changed the government but not the commercial culture. It was a pattern that would repeat on the other side of the world in waters far older and trade routes far more ancient than anything the Atlantic had yet produced. While English free traders were galloping across Romney Marsh and American patriots were tipping tea into Boston Harbor, on the other side of the world an entirely parallel universe of contraband was operating at a scale that dwarfed anything happening in the Atlantic. The coasts of China, Japan, and Southeast Asia had been producing sophisticated maritime smuggling operations for centuries before the Europeans arrived, and the confrontation between those operations and the European colonial commercial regimes would reshape the entire global trading order. China's relationship with maritime trade was, for most of its imperial history, officially one of controlled suspicion. The successive dynasties that governed China understood perfectly well that the sea lanes offered routes for commerce that were difficult to regulate, that merchants who operated from the coast with foreign contacts were potential threats to the social and fiscal order, and that the category of pirate and the category of smuggler blended together in the offshore world in ways that made simple policing impossible. The Ming dynasty's famous hygiene, the maritime prohibition that at various points banned Chinese subjects from going to sea at all, was one of the most comprehensive official prohibitions on commerce in human history. And it was, from the first day of its implementation, systematically violated. The men who violated it most effectively were known in later Chinese historiography as woku, a term usually translated as Japanese pirates, but which, as modern historians have demonstrated, referred in practice to a mixed population of Chinese, Japanese, Portuguese, and various other nationalities who operated from island bases off the Chinese coast and conducted a trade that was illegal on the Chinese side, variously legal or illegal on the Japanese side, and entirely normal from the perspective of everyone involved in it. The most prominent of these operators, a man named Wang Ji, who operated from the Goto Islands off Japan in the mid-16th century and ran a trading network stretching from Japan to Southeast Asia, was not a pirate in any meaningful sense. He was a merchant who had been excluded from the legal trade by the Haijin and had organized his business around that exclusion. Wang Ji's operation at its peak involved hundreds of ships and thousands of men, supplied ports along hundreds of miles of Chinese coastline with goods that were either unavailable or enormously expensive through official channels, and maintained relationships with local Chinese officials and merchants on both sides of the law. He was, in effect, running a trading company of significant regional importance, and the Chinese government's repeated military expeditions against him were unsuccessful, partly because his organization was too large and dispersed to destroy militarily, and partly because too many people along the Chinese coast depended on his trade to provide reliable intelligence against him. The pattern is exactly that of the Hawkhurst Gang, transposed to the China Sea and inflated to an oceanic scale. Japan presents its own remarkable chapter in maritime smuggling history, and one that connects directly to some of the most consequential moments in that country's history. The Tokugawa shogunate, which came to power in 1603 and would govern Japan until 1868, implemented a maritime isolation policy, sakoku, that was in some respects even more comprehensive than the Chinese haijin. Foreign ships were prohibited from entering Japanese ports except under specific and highly restricted conditions. Dutch merchants were confined to the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki harbour. Chinese merchants were permitted in limited numbers under strict supervision, and all other foreign contacts were prohibited on pain of death. This policy lasted in its most rigid form for about 200 years, and during those 200 years a thriving informal trade operated through the gaps in it. Goods moved between Japan and the mainland through third-party networks, through the Ryukyu Kingdom, modern Okinawa, which was simultaneously a nominal vassal of both the Japanese Satsuma domain and the Chinese emperor, and therefore a useful buffer zone where goods could change hands without either side needing to acknowledge the exchange. The Satsuma domain itself, one of the most powerful feudal domains in Japan, had a direct commercial interest in maintaining the Ryukyu smuggling channel, and used it for the import of Chinese goods that the official prohibition denied them. The combination of official prohibition, commercial necessity, and the creative use of geographic ambiguity produced a sophisticated informal trading system that operated consistently and reliably for generations. The arrival of American Commodore Matthew Perry and his black ships in 1853, the event that forced Japan to open its ports to American trade under threat of naval bombardment, is usually presented as the story of American technological power confronting Japanese isolationism. What is less often noted is that the isolation Japan was being forced to abandon was already substantially riddled with the informal trade that the Sakoku policy had never actually eliminated. The Japan that Perry encountered was not hermetically sealed. It was a country that had maintained its official isolation while conducting a busy informal commerce with the world through the multiple channels that human ingenuity had developed to circumvent the prohibition. The official policy had been, in the familiar pattern, substantially more impermeable on paper than in practice. The waters of the South China Sea, which connect the southern Chinese coast to Vietnam, Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, and the Malay Peninsula, have been among the world's most active smuggling corridors for as long as those coasts have had ports. The geography is favourable. Thousands of islands providing anchorages, coastal mangroves offering concealment, water passages that can be navigated only by people with local knowledge, and the commercial incentives have been consistently present. Different ports charge different duties on the same goods. Different rulers impose different restrictions on different categories of commerce. Different colonial regimes at different periods create different legal landscapes that the informal trade navigates with the ease of water finding the path of least resistance. The Malay pirates, another category that, on closer examination, blurs into the category of smuggler and informal trader, operated throughout the Strait of Malacca and the surrounding waters with a sophistication that the European colonial powers found alternately terrifying and impressive. The Ilernon and Balangingi peoples of the southern Philippines conducted what their own culture understood as legitimate maritime commerce, raiding and trading simultaneously, in a combination that made no distinction between what European law classified as piracy and what it classified as trade. When the Spanish and later the Dutch and British attempted to suppress them, they found the same problem that every enforcement power has found when confronting a maritime culture that has evolved over generations to operate in the interstitial spaces of official jurisdiction. The sea is very large, the coastline is very long, the communities are very tight, and the commercial incentives are very strong. The legacy of these Asian maritime smuggling traditions is not merely historical. The South China Sea remains one of the world's most active corridors for informal trade, and the methods and networks developed over centuries of operating outside official channels continue to shape commercial patterns in the region. The container ports of Singapore and Hong Kong, both of which grew to prominence partly on the basis of their role as entrepôts, as places where goods from one jurisdiction changed hands before being sent on to another jurisdiction under different documentation, are legitimate expressions of the same geographic and commercial logic that drove the informal traders of the Ming era and the Tokugawa period. But while Asia's great maritime smuggling traditions were centuries in the making, Europe was about to produce its own proof of a principle that every free trader from Carthage to Canton had demonstrated, that the ambitions of the most powerful man in the world are no match for the commercial instincts of a continent full of merchants who need goods that have been officially declared unavailable. Napoleon Bonaparte was, in most assessments, one of the most capable military and political minds in modern European history. He reorganized the French state, reformed the legal system, restructured the administrative map of Europe, and won battles that military historians still study with admiration. But his economic policy, specifically the continental system, his attempt to destroy British commercial power by blockading the entire European continent against British goods, represents one of the most spectacular failures of top-down economic planning in recorded history, and much of the reason it failed has to do with the unconquerable persistence of the smuggler. The logic of the continental system, announced in the Berlin Decree of 1806, was straightforward enough. Britain was, as Napoleon had correctly identified, financing its own wars against him and subsidizing the wars of its European allies primarily through the revenues generated by its massive commercial trade. If Napoleon could deny British goods access to the European market, if he could force the continent to refuse British exports, the British economy would contract, the government's revenues would dry up, and the war effort would collapse. Continental Europe was Britain's most important market. Without it, the argument ran, Britain would be reduced to commercial irrelevance. The flaw in this reasoning was one that any customs officer in Sussex could have identified immediately. You can declare a border closed, but you cannot make it impermeable. The European coastline extended for thousands of miles. The official enforcement apparatus of Napoleon's empire was spread thin across an enormous territory, and the economic incentive to move British goods into a market that officially denied their existence was enormous, precisely because the official denial kept driving up their price. The more thoroughly Napoleon's decrees were enforced in any particular area, the higher the price that British goods commanded there, and therefore the greater the reward for anyone who found a way to supply them. The island of Heligoland, a small rocky outcrop in the North Sea that Britain had captured from Denmark in 1807, became the most important single node in the smuggling network that systematically undermined Napoleon's grand strategy. Under British occupation, Heligoland was transformed from an insignificant fishing community into the largest free port in the world relative to its size, a warehouse island essentially, where British manufactured goods were stockpiled for distribution into the continent, through whatever channels the local expertise could devise. Ships that officially did not carry British goods sailed from Heligoland to the German coast, to the Baltic ports, to the Dutch shoreline. Merchants who officially did not trade with Britain maintained offices and relationships in Heligoland. The customs records of the ports that supplied Heligoland with goods to forward show the astonishing volume of this trade. In 1808 and 1809, at the height of the continental system's enforcement, more British goods entered Germany through Heligoland than had passed through the official legal channels in peacetime. The smuggling of British goods into Napoleonic Europe was not confined to the North Sea. The Spanish Peninsula, which became the centre of the military conflict after 1808, was also the centre of a massive informal trade in British cloth, hardware and colonial goods that operated through Portuguese ports and through the complex informal economies of the guerrilla-controlled countryside. Napoleon's bureaucratic apparatus for enforcing the continental system in Spain effectively did not function, partly because of the military disruption, partly because the Spanish population had no interest in cooperating with it, and partly because so many of the nominally Napoleonic officials in Spain had made private arrangements with the British traders who supplied them with things they could not otherwise obtain. France itself was not immune. French manufacturers and merchants who needed British raw materials, and who had, in many cases, built their entire production processes around the assumption of access to those materials, found ways to obtain them through neutral shipping, through falsified papers declaring goods to be of non-British origin, through third-country relabelling operations of baroque complexity, and through straightforward bribery of the customs officials who might otherwise have asked awkward questions. The continental system produced, among its unintended consequences, an enormous European infrastructure for the forgery of trade documents and the misrepresentation of goods' origins, a body of expertise that would prove extremely useful for smuggling operations of all kinds in the decades that followed. Napoleon himself, in one of the great moments of bureaucratic irony in European history, found himself obliged in 1810 to officially license certain categories of smuggling. French manufacturers of goods like silk and luxury items needed British customers, and French consumers wanted colonial products, sugar, coffee, cotton, that could only reach them through channels that technically violated the continental system. The licensing system for permitted trade through the blockade was the continental system admitting, in official paperwork, that it could not actually control the flows of commerce it had set out to stop. It was a more elegant surrender than most, dressed up in administrative language, but it was a surrender nonetheless. The deeper lesson of the continental system's failure is one about the relationship between economic reality and political will. Napoleon had the military power to conquer most of Europe. He had the administrative machinery to govern it. He did not have the power to make people ignore their economic interests and refuse commerce that was available, mutually beneficial and technically illegal only because a single man in Paris had decided it should be so. The smugglers of Heligoland, of the German coast, of the Spanish peninsula, and of the Channel itself were not ideologically opposed to Napoleon in most cases. They were simply responding rationally to the gap between the official price of goods and their market value, the same logic that had driven the English free traders and the Caribbean rum runners and every contraband operation in history. There is a detail about the continental system's enforcement that captures its fundamental absurdity with particular clarity. The system required French customs officials in occupied European territories to seize British goods wherever they found them. But the definition of British goods proved nearly impossible to apply in practice. The manufactured goods of the early industrial age did not carry obvious national identifiers. Cotton cloth woven in Manchester looked very much like cotton cloth woven in French textile centres. Hardware manufactured in Birmingham looked very much like hardware manufactured in Belgian workshops. The system of certificates of origin that was supposed to distinguish British from non-British goods became, almost immediately, a system for generating fraudulent certificates of origin, as the administrative apparatus required to verify them was simply not available across the thousands of miles of European commerce. The forgers who produced convincing certificates of continental origin for British goods were not doing anything their predecessors had not been doing for centuries. They were simply applying the ancient arts of commercial deception to the paperwork requirements of a new bureaucratic environment. When the continental system collapsed, as it did definitively with Napoleon's defeat, it left behind a continent that had been thoroughly educated in the arts of moving goods past official inspection. The smuggling networks built to circumvent the Berlin Decree did not dissolve after Waterloo. They adapted. The routes, the relationships, the specialised knowledge of which ports had, which weaknesses, which officials were open to what arrangements, which landscape features offered the best concealment. All of this accumulated expertise shifted to new goods and new purposes. The invisible infrastructure of European smuggling, forged in the Napoleonic Wars, would serve the next generation of contraband operations just as effectively as it had served the last. If the English Channel had its Sussex free traders and the Napoleonic era its Heligoland merchants, the defining smuggling story of the 20th century belongs to the Atlantic seaboard of the United States during the period from 1920 to 1933, when the 18th Amendment to the Constitution made the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors illegal across the entire country. The period known as Prohibition has been written about from so many angles. The organised crime it generated, the political corruption it required, the cultural transformation it catalysed, that it is easy to forget that at its core it was simply a very large smuggling problem, and that the methods used to address it were the same methods that had failed to suppress every large smuggling operation in history. The incentive was, once again, perfectly straightforward. A case of whiskey that could be purchased legally in Canada for a few dollars could be sold to a New York speakeasy for many times that amount. Scotch whiskey, rum from the Caribbean, wine from France, all of these goods had legitimate retail markets in Canada, Britain and the Caribbean, and eager illegal purchasers in the United States. The only obstacle was a 3-mile territorial water limit, and a customs service and coast guard that, while occasionally effective, were dramatically outnumbered by the commercial problem they were trying to address. The solution that the rum-running trade devised with characteristic ingenuity was Rum Row, a floating offshore market anchored just beyond the 3-mile limit, initially off the coast of New Jersey and later distributed along the entire Atlantic seaboard, where ships loaded with liquor sat at anchor and sold their cargo by the case to small fast boats that could make the quick run to shore. The mother ships were large enough to carry substantial cargo, some of them converted ocean liners or steam freighters, and they stayed outside territorial waters indefinitely, resupplying from Canadian and Caribbean ports as needed, and conducting a retail business through the sides of the hull to the queue of small craft that formed around them on any given day. At the peak of Rum Row's operation in the early 1920s, there were sometimes dozens of ships anchored in the loosely defined zone off New Jersey, each one a floating liquor store, and the parade of small boats ferrying cases of whiskey to shore was visible from the beach with the naked eye. The economics were so attractive that respectable shipping companies converted vessels to this purpose, that maritime lawyers developed sophisticated legal arguments about the rights of ships in international waters, and that the newspapers of the day covered the scene with a mixture of outrage and barely suppressed admiration. The Coast Guard's response to Rum Row went through several phases, each one escalating in technological ambition, and each one being matched, eventually, by the rum runners. Initially, the 3-mile limit was the definitive boundary. Coast Guard vessels could not legally approach the mother ships, and the small shore boats stayed just outside that limit until they were ready to make their dash. Congress responded by extending American jurisdiction to 12 miles, which pushed the mother ships further out but did not stop the trade. The rum runners responded by building faster boats, eventually achieving speeds that the Coast Guard vessels could not match, and by improving their radio communications to allow rapid intelligence about the positions of revenue craft. The radio technology arms race is one of the more interesting technical subplots of the Prohibition era. The rum-running operations developed sophisticated communication networks that allowed shore-based operators to track the positions of Coast Guard vessels in real time, and to direct the rum boats along routes that minimized interception risk. The Coast Guard, recognizing the problem, began intercepting rum-running radio communications and eventually developed the capacity to triangulate and locate shore-based radio transmitters. The rum runners responded by using mobile transmitters, by encrypting their communications, and by developing code systems of increasing sophistication. The back and forth between the enforcement and evasion technologies of the 1920s rum trade anticipates, in miniature, the electronic intelligence competitions of the Second World War that followed it. Al Capone's organization in Chicago is the most famous of the Prohibition-era crime empires, and its supply chain illustrates how the Atlantic rum trade connected to the inland distribution networks. Capone's people did not primarily operate boats on the Atlantic. Chicago's geography did not lend itself to that, but they were connected through business arrangements to the Canadian suppliers and the coastal importers who filled the pipeline from the offshore motherships to the shore and then inland to the speakeasies, restaurants, and private clubs that constituted the retail market. The logistical chain from a distillery in Scotland to a glass in a Chicago speakeasy passed through multiple criminal hands, each adding their margin, each relying on relationships and operational security methods developed in the offshore smuggling trade. The geographical diversity of Prohibition-era smuggling is often underappreciated. The Atlantic seaboard was the highest profile and best documented corridor, but liquor was entering the United States from every direction simultaneously. The Canadian border stretched for nearly 4,000 miles, most of it through wilderness or small rural communities where enforcement was essentially impossible. Rum runners crossed the Detroit River, the St. Lawrence, the Great Lakes, and dozens of smaller water bodies with boats loaded with Canadian whiskey, and with methods ranging from the straightforward, go fast and hope to outrun the patrol boat, to the elaborate. There are documented cases of liquor being moved under the surface of the Detroit River in weighted cases on pulley systems, of tunnels dug under border crossings, of legitimate farm machinery shipments with hollowed-out spaces packed with bottles. The southern border presented similar challenges, with tequila and other spirits flowing north from Mexico through desert country that no enforcement agency had the resources to patrol. The Gulf Coast received rum from Cuba and the Caribbean on almost exactly the same model as the Atlantic Rum Row, with flotillas of fast boats servicing offshore motherships and landing on beaches that the state and local authorities in Florida, Louisiana, and Texas were either unable or unwilling to police seriously. The social world of the rum row era is one of the more entertaining chapters in American maritime history. The motherships anchored offshore developed, over the course of the 1920s, something approaching their own social infrastructure. The larger vessels had proper cabins for their officers, mess facilities, and in at least some documented cases, entertainment options appropriate to their role as destinations for the small boat visitors who came out to do business. Contemporary accounts describe vessels where business could be conducted in a relatively civilized manner, cases of whiskey changing hands over a table, with something approximating a receipt for the transaction, in conditions that were more reminiscent of a wholesale warehouse than a criminal conspiracy. The legal status of these vessels was a genuine puzzle for the authorities, and the rum runners exploited its ambiguity with considerable skill. Ships registered in other countries, operating outside territorial waters, carrying cargo that was legal in their country of registration, were engaged in activity that American law could not directly prohibit. The prohibition applied to the United States, not to the rest of the world. The legal arguments around the 3-mile and later 12-mile limits were genuine legal arguments, not mere criminological obstruction, and they occupied American courts for years. The rum runners employed lawyers of real quality who could articulate these arguments with precision, and the legal record of the Prohibition era is dense with carefully reasoned opinions about where American sovereignty ended and international waters began. The social cost of Prohibition is a subject that continues to generate debate, but a few dimensions of it are directly relevant to the smuggling story. The organization of the smuggling supply chain created the infrastructure for large-scale organized crime in American cities in a way that had no precedent. Before Prohibition, American criminal enterprise was largely local, fragmented, and limited in its commercial scale. The demand for a commodity, alcohol, that was nationally present and legally unobtainable, created the incentive for the development of national-scale criminal organizations with the capital, the logistics, and the enforcement capacity to supply it. The men who built those organizations, the Capones, the Lucky Lucianos, the Arnold Rothsteins, were not uniquely malevolent geniuses who would have done what they did regardless of legal context. They were entrepreneurs who responded to an extraordinary business opportunity that the law had inadvertently created. After Prohibition ended, these organizations did not dissolve. They adapted. The capital, the relationships, the institutional knowledge of how to operate large-scale illegal commerce, all of it survived the end of alcohol prohibition and found new applications. The narcotics trade, which would eventually dwarf everything that came before it, was in part built on the organizational foundation laid by the rum runners of the 1920s. The families and networks that had moved whiskey from Rum Row to Manhattan speakeasies in 1928 were moving heroin from the Middle East through Marseille to American cities by 1955, using methods that owed a great deal to the offshore supply chain their predecessors had pioneered. The volume of money flowing through the illegal liquor trade was so enormous that it overwhelmed the capacity of underpaid law enforcement officials at every level to resist it. Police officers, customs agents, Coast Guard personnel, judges, politicians. The institutional structure of enforcement was riddled with purchased accommodations. This was not merely a matter of individual venality, though there was plenty of that. It was a structural problem. The legal economy of many communities was substantially organized around the illegal trade. In the fishing villages of New Jersey and Long Island and Massachusetts, where rum running provided an income supplement that was the difference between poverty and subsistence, the community dynamics of complicity were exactly what they had been in 18th century Sussex. The man who accepted a payment to look the other way was not, in the judgment of his neighbours and his family, committing a serious moral offence. He was accommodating economic reality. Prohibition ended in 1933 with the passage of the 21st Amendment. The immediate cause was the Depression. The federal government desperately needed the tax revenue that legal liquor sales would generate, and the social consensus about the wisdom of the experiment had collapsed. But it is worth noting that the amendment also represented exactly the same logic as Pitt's reduction of the tea duty in 1784. The recognition that a prohibition with a sufficiently powerful economic incentive behind it cannot be enforced at any acceptable cost, and that the rational response is to regulate rather than prohibit, collecting revenue rather than paying enforcement costs for nothing. The infrastructure of the Prohibition-era smuggling trade did not disappear with the amendment. The fast boats, the communication networks, the corrupt relationships, the organisational capacity for moving large quantities of goods across water, all of it survived and found new applications. Some of it found its way into the drug trade that would become the dominant smuggling story of the second half of the 20th century. Some of it found its way into the legitimate maritime economy, operated by men who had learned their seamanship in the rum-running business and now applied it to fishing, freight and pleasure boating. The legacy of Rum Row was not simply the end of prohibition, it was the creation of a lasting infrastructure for organised maritime contraband. There is a pub in the town of Rye on the East Sussex coast called the Mermaid Inn, and it has been receiving guests in some form since the 12th century. It has low beams, a massive fireplace, rooms that lean slightly in the way of very old buildings, and a set of stories attached to it that are the kind of thing that gets printed in tour guides and repeated to visitors in measured, practiced tones. The stories are about smugglers, about the notorious Hawkhurst Gang, who reportedly used the Mermaid as one of their bases, about the hidden passages that supposedly ran under the building, about the cellars where brandy was stored, about the gang members who allegedly sat drinking openly in the bar with their pistols on the table, defying the local authorities to do anything about them. Some of this is almost certainly embellished. The romantic history of English smuggling has been through a great deal of Victorian and Edwardian elaboration, when the period became fashionable as adventure material and local communities discovered that tales of heroic free traders were more attractive to visitors than tales of violent criminal gangs. But the physical reality underneath the stories is genuine enough. The south of England is riddled with concealed spaces, underground passages, and architectural deceptions that have been documented by historians and archaeologists as having served the contraband trade. The geology of the region is part of the explanation. The chalk and clay formations of Sussex and Kent are relatively easy to excavate, and the landscape had already been shaped by millennia of human activity. Roman villas with their underground passages, medieval ecclesiastical complexes with their crypts and undercrofts, agricultural buildings with their root cellars and grain stores, before the smugglers began adapting the existing infrastructure for their purposes. What the free traders added to this existing underground landscape was a systematic, connecting logic. Passages that ran between buildings that official observation would not connect, access points concealed under flagstones or behind movable walls, routes that allowed goods to move through the centre of a town without ever appearing on the streets. The village of Rottingdean near Brighton provides a particularly well-documented example. A network of passages running under the village street connected several of the larger houses and emerged at a point near the beach, a system that would have allowed goods landed on the shore to be moved directly to storage without crossing the open ground where revenue officers might be watching. Some of these passages have been explored and mapped, others have been partially excavated by modern researchers. The system was not simple, and the labour required to create it would have been substantial, which tells us something about the seriousness of the investment the local community was making in the trade's long-term infrastructure. In the cliffs themselves, the caves of the Sussex coast serve a similar function. Natural caves and caves enlarged from natural formations appear at intervals along the chalk cliffs, and many of them were used as temporary storage points between the landing of goods and their inland dispersal. The ideal cave for smuggling purposes was above the high water mark, to avoid flooding, accessible by rope from the cliff top, to allow goods to be transferred from boats to cliff-top ponies without going through any town, and invisible from the sea, to avoid being surveyed by revenue cutters. Caves meeting this specification are not uncommon along this coast, and a number of them retain, in their floors and walls, the physical evidence of their contraband past. Rings cut into the rock to secure ropes, flattened areas where casks were stacked, the occasional iron fastening that once held a door or hatch. France had its own architectural tradition of contraband concealment, which took rather different forms because the French landscape and the French trade, primarily focused on goods going out rather than coming in, imposed different requirements. The wine-producing regions of Brittany and Normandy that supplied the English market developed a parallel geography of hidden spaces, false-bottomed carts, and concealed storage on farms and in buildings along the routes from vineyard to coast. The Breton fishing villages that served as the French end of the cross-channel trade had their own version of the cellar networks, that the Sussex communities maintained on the other side of the water, and some of the family connections between the two communities were real and old. Fishermen who had known each other for generations, who spoke enough of each other's language for commercial purposes, and who had maintained their own informal cross-channel commerce for a very long time before the English Customs Service decided to make it a matter of official concern. The Mediterranean had its own variant of this hidden architecture, centred not on the chalk cliffs and tavern cellars of northern Europe, but on the fortified coastal watchtowers, isolated island anchorages, and labyrinthine old town streets of ports like Marseille, Genoa, and the coasts of Spain and North Africa. The smuggling of goods into and out of the various Mediterranean customs regimes, a patchwork of different jurisdictions, different duties, and different enforcement philosophies, had produced over centuries a physical environment optimized for concealment. Buildings that presented a blank face to the official harbour front opened through hidden passages to the water's edge on their other side. Warehouses connected to other warehouses by doors set into what appeared to be solid party walls. Stairways that descended to water-level cellars accessible only from the sea at low tide. What all of these physical expressions of the smuggling trade have in common is the depth of community investment they represent. A system of underground passages connecting the buildings of a village is not a hasty improvisation. It is a capital project, requiring planning, labour, and the cooperation of every property owner along the route. The decision to build such a system represents a community decision that the trade is worth this level of permanent commitment, that the benefit is large enough to justify an infrastructure that will be difficult to remove or explain if the authorities ever find it, and that the community trusts itself to maintain the secret over the years and decades required to amortize the investment. This is, in a sense, the most remarkable thing about the physical legacy of smuggling. It tells us that these were not casual crimes of opportunity, but deliberate, organized, multi-generational enterprises that communities entered into with clear eyes and maintained with genuine institutional sophistication. The tunnel under Rye or the cave in the Sussex cliffs is not the work of a single desperate man. It is the work of a community that had decided collectively that its interests were better served by the contraband trade than by compliance with the tax law, and that had the organisation and the solidarity to act on that decision over a long period of time. The greatest smuggling operation in modern history was not run by a criminal gang or a community of fishermen or a flotilla of rum runners. It was run effectively by the British Empire, and it involved a product, opium, whose consequences were so catastrophically different from tea and brandy that the story occupies a different moral dimension entirely, even as it repeats, with eerie precision, the same economic and political patterns that appear in every smuggling story. The background requires a brief sketch of the British East India Company's position in the early 19th century. The company, which had begun as a trading enterprise in the 17th century and had gradually accumulated what amounted to sovereign power over large parts of the Indian subcontinent, was by 1800 in a position of peculiar commercial difficulty. It had an enormous appetite for Chinese goods, tea above all, but also silk, porcelain and other luxury products that the British market consumed in vast quantities. But the Chinese imperial government, which had a long-established policy of restricting foreign trade to a single port, Canton, and demanding payment in silver, was not interested in British-manufactured goods and had no intention of opening its markets further. The result was a trade that consistently drained silver from Britain and the East India Company to China, with no equivalent flow in the other direction. The solution that the company developed, not through a single calculated decision, but through a gradual commercial evolution over several decades, was to use opium grown in Bengal as a substitute for silver in the China trade. The company could not itself legally trade opium into China, where it was banned, but it could sell opium at auction in Calcutta to private merchants, known as country traders, who would then carry it to the Chinese coast and sell it to local Chinese merchants who moved it inland through their own networks. The company maintained formal deniability. The practical effect was that an enormous flow of opium was being directed into China, with the company's full knowledge and deliberate commercial encouragement. The ships that carried this opium to the Chinese coast were among the most remarkable vessels of their era. The opium clippers, ships like the Red Rover, the Sylph, and the later and more famous composite clippers designed specifically for speed, were built to be fast, manoeuvrable, and capable of making the run from Calcutta to the China coast and back in the minimum possible time. Speed was commercially important because opium was perishable and because the margins on a fast voyage were substantially better than on a slow one. But it was also tactically important because the ships were, technically speaking, smugglers. They were moving a cargo that the Chinese government had prohibited into waters where that government's junks might attempt to intercept them. The ships that carried this opium to the Chinese coast were among the most remarkable vessels of their era. The opium clippers, ships like the Red Rover, the Sylph, and the later and more famous composite clippers designed specifically for speed, were built to be fast, maneuverable, and capable of making the run from Calcutta to the China coast and back in the minimum possible time. Speed was commercially important because opium was perishable and because the margins on a fast voyage were substantially better than on a slow one. But it was also tactically important because the ships were, technically speaking, smugglers. They were moving a cargo that the Chinese government had prohibited into waters where that government's junks might attempt to intercept them. The design of these vessels represents one of the more remarkable examples of purpose-built evasion technology in the history of maritime trade. The clipper ship in its general form, the long narrow hull optimized for speed rather than cargo capacity, the enormous spread of canvas, the fine-lined bow designed to cut through rather than push aside the water, was developed partly in response to the demands of the opium trade, where the premium on speed was large enough to justify the sacrifice of carrying capacity. The men who sailed these ships were some of the finest deep-water sailors of the 19th century, men who had developed an intimate practical knowledge of the monsoon patterns of the Indian Ocean and the complex tidal conditions of the Chinese coast. Their seamanship was genuine and impressive, even in the service of a commerce whose human consequences were catastrophic. The receiving end of the opium trade, the Chinese coast and the inland distribution networks, was organised by merchants whose sophistication matched anything that the British end could produce. The compradors and trading houses of Canton and later Shanghai, who handled the Chinese side of the opium distribution, were commercial organisations of considerable complexity, maintaining extensive networks of agents throughout the interior of China, managing credit and currency exchange across enormous distances, and operating with a discretion about the source of their profits that their counterparts in the tea and silk trades had learned over generations. The same family networks that had operated the officially sanctioned trade in silk and porcelain adapted their existing infrastructure to handle a new commodity that arrived through different channels but required the same organisational capacity for inland distribution. What made the Chinese distribution network for opium so resilient in the face of official prohibition was a combination of factors that should, by now, be entirely familiar. The profit margins were large. The communities involved had organised their commercial lives around the trade and had too much invested in its continuation to cooperate with official suppression. The officials charged with enforcement were underpaid, and operating in an environment where the bribe offered to overlook a shipment was more immediately relevant to their family's welfare than the abstract obligation to uphold an imperial edict. And the geographic scale of China's coastline and interior made comprehensive enforcement simply impossible with the administrative resources available to the Qing government. The Chinese coastal authorities charged with enforcing the opium prohibition were operating in a commercial environment where the bribery of officials was so systematic and so well organised that it functioned less like corruption and more like an informal tax system. The merchants who moved opium inland had relationships with local officials that were maintained through regular payments, and those officials in turn provided the intelligence that allowed the coastal interception efforts to be structured in ways that were minimally disruptive to the actual trade. It was a system that served almost everyone's short-term interest while destroying a significant portion of the Chinese population through addiction. By the 1830s, the scale of the opium trade was enormous. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 4 and 5 million Chinese people were opium smokers by the time the Qing dynasty moved to suppress the trade definitively in 1838. The commissioner appointed to solve the problem, Lin Zexu, was one of the more impressive bureaucrats of his era, a man who combined genuine moral clarity about the damage the drug was doing with the practical authority to take drastic action. He seized and destroyed over 20,000 chests of opium belonging to British and American merchants, wrote a famous open letter to Queen Victoria appealing to her conscience, and attempted to close the southern Chinese coast to foreign ships engaged in the trade. The British government's response was to declare war. The First Opium War, fought from 1839 to 1842, was justified in British official language as a matter of commerce and treaty rights. The right of British merchants to trade freely, the obligation of the Chinese government to honour existing commercial arrangements. In substance, it was a war fought to preserve the British right to sell addictive drugs to the Chinese population in violation of Chinese law. The British won with the technological advantage of steam-powered warships against Chinese sailing junks, and the Treaty of Nanking that ended the conflict forced China to open additional ports to foreign trade, to pay an enormous indemnity, and to cede Hong Kong to Britain. The opium trade was not formally legalised by the treaty, but it continued, expanded, and was eventually legalised by the further treaties that followed the Second Opium War of 1856 to 1860. The moral dimension of the opium trade distinguishes it from most smuggling stories in one crucial respect. The harm was not distributed across a population of willing consumers making individual choices, but was imposed on a society through systematic, commercially driven promotion of addiction. The Chinese officials who protested the trade were right. Lin Zexu was right. The opium merchants who argued that they were merely supplying a demand that existed independently of their actions were engaging in a self-serving rationalization of a kind that the history of drugs has made tediously familiar. What the opium trade shares with every other smuggling story is the fundamental logic of the gap, the difference between what the commodity costs in one market and what it commands in another, in this case amplified to an international scale by the power of a colonial empire to override the laws of a sovereign nation. The Hawkhurst Gang could hide from the revenue service, but could not shoot it. The East India Company had the Royal Navy. The scale of violence available to enforce the supply chain was qualitatively different, and that difference mattered enormously to the people on the receiving end. The legacy of the opium trade in China is one of the most enduring grievances in modern Chinese political culture, and the century of humiliation that Chinese historians and politicians used to describe the period from the Opium Wars to the Communist Revolution in 1949 has its origin in the moment when the world's most powerful empire decided that its commercial interests in drug trafficking outweighed the sovereignty of one of the world's oldest civilizations. This is a story that connects the history of smuggling to the history of imperialism in ways that are uncomfortable but impossible to ignore, and it is a reminder that the romantic narrative of the cunning smuggler outsmarting the pompous customs official has its limits as a moral framework. Not all smuggling is tea. Not all enforcement is tyranny. The difference matters. The Channel Tunnel, which opened in 1994 after years of engineering and decades of political debate, was among many other things the realization of a very old smuggling fantasy. Since the days of the Hawkhurst Gang and their predecessors, the men who moved goods between England and France had imagined a world in which they did not have to do it on water, a world where the risk of the night crossing, the vulnerability to weather and to revenue cutters, the dependence on tides and wind and the nervousness of the crew could be eliminated in favour of something more reliable. The tunnel they imagined would have been very different from the gleaming rail link that actually materialised, but the basic appeal was the same, a reliable, controllable, sheltered corridor between the two coasts. The actual Channel Tunnel, needless to say, became a smuggling corridor almost immediately upon opening. The methods were different. People rather than brandy casks became the primary commodity being moved outside official channels, as the tunnel attracted those seeking to reach Britain without formal documentation. But the underlying dynamic was the same as it had always been. A corridor exists. People want to use it. The official price of using it through legal channels is higher than many people can or will pay. Therefore, an informal channel develops alongside the official one. There is a peculiar irony in the fact that the most famous modern smuggling debate in Britain concerns not goods at all, in the traditional sense, but people, human beings, who are, in their own assessment, doing exactly what the Sussex fishermen did in the 18th century, moving a commodity across a channel because the official price of the legal crossing is higher than they can pay, because the demand on the other side is genuine and large, and because the geography of the situation creates an opportunity that human ingenuity will always find a way to exploit. The moral and political complexities of people smuggling are enormous and different in fundamental ways from the moral and political complexities of brandy smuggling. But the structural logic is the same, and the smuggler's argument, that an arbitrary line drawn by distant authorities should not determine who can be where, has not become simpler or less contested in the centuries since Thomas Kingsmill first made it with a cargo of tea. The geography of smuggling in the contemporary world would be immediately recognizable to Thomas Kingsmill or John Hancock. The same principles apply. Find the weakest point in the enforcement perimeter, exploit the gap between official and market price, maintain operational security through community solidarity and the corruption of underpaid officials, and adapt continuously to whatever countermeasures the authorities deploy. The goods are different: cigarettes, counterfeit pharmaceuticals, exotic wildlife, currency, people, and of course narcotics in enormous quantities. But the operational logic is unchanged. The cigarette smuggling that has characterized European trade since the development of high tobacco taxes in the 20th century is, in its structure, almost identical to the 18th century tea trade. The tax on cigarettes in high-tax countries like Britain or Scandinavia creates the same kind of enormous gap between the official retail price and the market price in low-tax neighbouring countries that the tea duty created in the 1700s. The response has been the same: a highly organised trade that uses legitimate logistics infrastructure, container ships, trucks, legitimate seeming trading companies, to move large quantities of tobacco with minimal documentation, supplemented by more overtly criminal networks that manufacture counterfeit cigarettes in factories often located in countries where the rule of law is thin. The customs services of European countries seize millions of cigarettes every year and estimate that this represents a small fraction of the total flow. The pattern is, to any student of English smuggling history, deeply familiar. The trade in endangered wildlife, which draws less public attention than drug trafficking, but generates annual revenues estimated in the tens of billions of dollars, represents a contemporary smuggling story that has direct echoes in the ancient spice and luxury goods trade. The demand for rare animals, animal parts, and exotic plants in various Asian markets, rhinoceros horn, elephant ivory, live exotic birds and reptiles, traditional medicine ingredients derived from protected species, creates the same commercial logic as the demand for silk in the Roman world, or pepper in medieval Europe, a product available in one part of the world that the laws and regulations of another part of the world make expensive or illegal to obtain legitimately, and therefore profitable to move informally. The routes used by wildlife traffickers follow the same contours as every other smuggling trade, through countries with weak enforcement, through intermediary markets where documentation can be acquired or forged, through postal systems and cargo containers and diplomatic channels. The sophistication of the methods matches the sophistication of the enforcement, in exactly the same arms race that has characterized the smuggling trade since the customs officers of ancient Mesopotamia first tried to count what was in a merchant's cart. The drug trade, which is the dominant contraband story of the modern world, operates at a scale that the historical smugglers of the English Channel would have found unimaginable, but through mechanisms they would have recognized immediately: the value of the cocaine flowing out of South America, North America, and Europe represents perhaps the most extreme example in history of the gap between production cost and retail price that drives all smuggling. Cocaine that can be produced for a few dollars a kilogram in Colombia retails for tens of thousands of dollars a kilogram in London or New York, creating an incentive for transportation that has funded the creation of smuggling organizations of corporate scale and sophistication. The submarine, which the smuggling imagination had contemplated long before the technology was practical, became a reality in drug smuggling in the late 20th century. The semi-submersibles and fully submersible vessels built in jungle workshops in Colombia and Ecuador to move cocaine across the Pacific and Atlantic are among the more remarkable examples of informal engineering in the modern world. Low-profile vessels, often made of fiberglass and powered by diesel engines removed from ordinary commercial vehicles capable of carrying several tons of cocaine at a depth that makes them very difficult to detect by conventional maritime patrol. They represent exactly the same principle as the fast cutters of the Sussex smugglers, or the rum-running speedboats of Prohibition. The principle that if the enforcement asset uses one technology, the evasion asset must use a better or different technology, and that the asymmetric incentives of the smuggling trade will always generate the investment in innovation required to stay ahead. The dark web, which became the operational environment for a significant portion of global drug retail in the 2000s, represents the latest iteration of this technological evolution, and it follows the same patterns as every previous generation of smuggling infrastructure with a fidelity that is almost eerie. The dark web marketplaces operated by encrypted, pseudonymous transactions, The use of postal systems and ordinary package delivery services to distribute narcotics in small quantities disguised as legitimate commercial goods, the development of trusted intermediary relationships in an environment where legal enforcement was technically possible but practically very difficult. All of this maps with remarkable precision onto the structure of the 18th century tea trade. Different technology, same logic. Find the channel the official enforcement apparatus cannot effectively monitor, use it for as long as it remains viable, and when it is disrupted, adapt to a new channel. There is something almost poignant about the continuity of the smuggling story across all these centuries and all these very different goods and places and people. The intelligence that allowed Thomas Kingsmill to read the night sky, and the tide charts and the social landscape of the Sussex Customs Service in 1748 is recognisably the same intelligence that allows a modern logistics coordinator to route a container through 5 different ports and 6 different ownership structures to obscure the origin of its contents. The community solidarity that protected the identity of a Cornish wrecking family from official investigation in 1780 is recognisably the same solidarity that protects drug trafficking organisations from informers in modern cities. The corruption of a riding officer who accepted a bribe to look the other way is recognisably the same corruption that hollows out customs services and border agencies in countries where the traffickers have more money than the governments. And the response to all of this? The periodic recognition by governments that prohibition creates more problems than it solves, that the gap between official price and market price is the real driver of the trade, that enforcement is a rearguard action against a logic that cannot be defeated by force, is also recognisably consistent across the centuries. The repeal of the tea duty in 1784, the end of prohibition in 1933, the gradual legalisation of cannabis in various jurisdictions over recent decades, each represents the same fundamental recognition that the smuggler's existence is an argument about taxation and prohibition policy, and that the most effective response to that argument is not a faster revenue cutter, but a more thoughtful calculation of what should be taxed at what rate and what should simply be allowed. On a summer morning in 2014, a team of archaeologists working in a cellar in the old town of Rye, uncovering the foundations of a building scheduled for renovation, found themselves standing in a passage they had not expected. It ran under the street in a direction that did not correspond to any utility line or any structure shown on any historical survey of the town. The passage was constructed of old brick, consistent with 18th century construction, and it showed signs of considerable use. Worn flagstone floor, the remains of wooden fixtures on the walls, rusted iron rings at intervals that might once have supported shelves or racks. Soil samples from the floor yielded fragments consistent with compacted straw, an organic material that could have come from the wrapping of casks or bales. Nobody was certain what they were looking at, because certainty about these things is never entirely available. But the local historians who were consulted had no doubt. This was part of the infrastructure of the old free trade, a surviving remnant of the system that had moved brandy and tea and lace through the centre of Rye, while the revenue officers walked the streets above. It had been sitting under the town for 250 years, long after the trade it had served was finished, long after the last person who had known its purpose was dead, waiting to be found. There is something deeply moving about the image of that passage, sealed and forgotten under a town that has gone on living its official life above it for 2.5 centuries. The tunnel represents, in concrete form, the hidden layer of history that exists beneath every official account, the layer where ordinary people made their accommodations with authority, where the community's actual economic life was organised, where decisions were made that the historical record would never quite capture. The official history of Rye in the 18th century is the history of the port, the customs house, the magistrates, the church. The actual history of Rye in the 18th century ran partly through that tunnel. The smuggler's legacy is everywhere, if you know how to look for it. It is in the place names of the Sussex coast, Brandyhole Lane, Smugglers Way, Free Traders Road, that preserve in their syllables a memory of what went on here. It is in the architecture of the old trading towns, in the cellars and the passages and the buildings with their odd angles and their unexpected interior spaces. It is in the folk songs that encode, in suitably obscure language, the signals and routes of the old trade. It is in the stories that families tell about their ancestors, the great-great-grandfather who was a tubman on the Romney Marsh, the ancestor who rode with the Hawkhurst Gang, the ancestor who helped herself to goods from a wreck in a Cornish cove. But the real legacy of the smuggler goes deeper than local colour and romantic criminology. It is a persistent question about the relationship between law and community, between official authority and the informal economies that develop wherever official authority imposes costs that the community judges excessive. Every smuggling operation in history has been, at its core, a market correcting for what it perceived as a pricing error, the difference between what a thing is worth and what the law, through taxation or prohibition, has decided it should cost. The smuggler's argument is always the same. The law is wrong, the price is wrong, the restriction is unjust, and the practical reality of human desire and human commerce cannot be corrected by official decree. Sometimes the smuggler is right. The tea duty of the 18th century was extractive and counterproductive, and the communities that organised around evading it were doing something that posterity has not had much trouble forgiving. The rum runners of Prohibition were supplying a market that most Americans agreed should be legal, and whose illegality most Americans found bewildering. In these cases, the smuggler was in effect an advance agent of the policy correction that eventually came, and the history of the trade becomes, in retrospect, a story about the limits of overreach. Sometimes the smuggler is wrong in ways that matter enormously. The opium trade was not a market correction. It was the systematic imposition of addiction on a population that had not asked for it. The modern drug trade, at its most destructive, represents not a correction of excessive prohibition, but a parasitic exploitation of addiction that produces suffering on an enormous scale. The people being harmed are not abstract customs revenues. They are families, communities, and individuals whose lives are shaped by the flows of a trade they did not choose and cannot escape. The useful thing that the history of smuggling teaches is not that smugglers are heroes or that laws are pointless. It is that the gap between the law and economic reality is always a site of human ingenuity, and that the wideness of that gap is the most reliable predictor of the scale and sophistication of the enterprise that will develop to bridge it. Where the gap is wide, the organisation will be large, the methods will be creative, and the enforcement costs will be enormous. Where the gap is narrow, where the law reflects something close to what the market would produce on its own, the smuggler's incentive fades and the problem diminishes. The long view of smuggling history also contains a quieter insight about the texture of ordinary human life across the centuries. The people who carried brandy up beaches in the dark, who sewed silk into the linings of their coats, who moved opium down the Pearl River in sampans, who ran rum in fast cutters off the coast of New Jersey. These were, for the most part, not criminals in any meaningful cultural sense of the word. They were people doing what people have always done, finding a way to make a living, to provide for their families, to participate in the commercial world on terms that felt fair rather than extortionate. The institutions of official trade, the customs houses and the revenue cutters and the magistrates' courts, represented one way of organising that commercial world, and the informal networks of the smuggling trade represented another, and across centuries and continents the two coexisted in a tension that neither side could fully resolve. The history of that tension is, in a very real sense, the history of the relationship between states and the people they govern. States need revenue. Revenue requires taxation. Taxation creates incentives for evasion. Evasion requires enforcement. Enforcement costs money and generates resentment. Resentment produces the creative ingenuity of the smuggler, who finds a way through the system and in doing so demonstrates the limits of what official power can actually accomplish. This is not a counsel of despair about the possibility of governance. It is a counsel of realism about its limits. The Sussex Free Traders did not prove that customs duties are impossible. They proved that customs duties set at punitive levels, without reference to the commercial realities of the communities they affect, without adequate enforcement resources, and without the basic legitimacy that comes from some form of democratic consent, will be evaded. The lesson is not that you cannot have customs duties. It is that customs duties must be set at levels that reflect what enforcement can realistically accomplish, that leave the gap between the official price and the market price too small to justify the organisation of a criminal enterprise. Every government that has learned this lesson has reduced the scale of its smuggling problem. Every government that has refused to learn it has produced another Hawkhurst Gang, another rum row, another generation of ingenious, determined people finding their way through the gap between what the law says and what the world is. Thomas Kingsmill, standing at the stern of the Speedwell in the darkness off the Sussex coast in 1748, was not thinking about policy. He was thinking about the tide and the revenue cutter he had seen an hour ago to the north, and whether the men on the beach had heard the signal correctly, and whether the brandy would be off the boat and under cover before the night got any lighter. He was a skilled man in a dangerous business, navigating by instinct and experience through a landscape he knew in his bones, doing what generations of men before him had done on this same stretch of coast. He was, in the long view, a footnote in an argument between governments and markets that was already ancient when he was born, and that continues in different languages and different latitudes to this day. The ship slipped into the cove. The men on the beach moved forward. The goods changed hands in darkness as they had always done. In the gap between what is and what authority insists should be, in the permanent, restless, irrepressible space where the smuggler lives, somewhere in the old town of Rye, under the flagstones of a passage that archaeologists documented and resealed, the walls are still stained with the ghost of 2 centuries of contraband. The passage goes nowhere now, but for a long time it went everywhere,